something shifted last night. Not in the way that most breaking news shifts. A headline, a reaction, a counter-reaction, and then things settle back into the usual rhythm. This was different. This was the kind of shift that doesn't reverse. And I want to walk you through exactly what happened, what it means, and where the logic of this conflict is now pointing. Because if you're only following the surface level coverage, you are missing the deeper architecture of what is unfolding. Let's start with what we actually saw. The Israelis expanded their targeting. They went after critical infrastructure, not just military assets, not just command posts, infrastructure, the kind of targeting that sends a message about intent. And in response, Iran did something we have not seen at this scale before. They began going after energy systems, not symbolic strikes, not warning shots, coordinated, deliberate attacks on the energy architecture that the global economy depends on. And the moment that happened, this stopped being a regional conflict and became something else entirely. To understand why that matters so much, you have to think about what the Gulf region actually represents. This is not just a collection of countries that happen to sit on oil reserves. This is the physical foundation of modern industrial civilization. Cheap, accessible energy is what makes everything else function. Your supply chains, your manufacturing base, your transportation networks, your food systems, all of it is built on top of energy. Remove that foundation, even partially, even temporarily, and the effects don't stay contained. They radiate outward. Prices move, supply chains tighten, markets respond, and suddenly a conflict that started in one region is felt in places that have nothing to do with the original dispute. So the first thing to understand is that we have crossed a threshold. We have moved from a conflict about territory or political outcomes into something that is targeting the system itself. And that is a fundamentally different kind of war. Now, here's what makes this particularly significant. This is not accidental escalation. This is not simply retaliation in the traditional sense where one side hits back at roughly the same level to signal resolve and then both sides wait to see what happens next. What Iran is doing is strategic. It reflects a clear-read understanding of their own position. They know they cannot win a conventional war against the United States and its allies. That is not a realistic path for them. So they are not trying to fight on that battlefield. Instead, they are targeting the system that supports their opponent. They are going after the economic infrastructure that sustains American power projection and its regional alliances. And that strategy, whatever you think of it, morally or politically, is coherent. It is designed to impose costs that go far beyond the battlefield. At the same time, look at what the Israelis and the Americans are pursuing. These are not limited objectives. These are not efforts to contain Iran, to push it back to some acceptable baseline and then stabilize. These are maximalist objectives. The goal appears to be the fundamental degradation of Iran's ability to function as a coherent state. You can see it in the targeting decisions, leadership, economic nodes, infrastructure. The logic is to create such intense internal pressure that the country fractures from within, that the population turns against the government, that the system collapses under the weight of the damage being inflicted on it. And here is why that combination is so dangerous. When both sides are pursuing maximalist objectives, there is no natural off-ramp. There is no point at which one side can say, we've achieved enough. Let's talk. Because the objectives themselves are absolute. One side is trying to dismantle the other. The other side is trying to break the system that supports its opponent. Neither of those goals has a halfway point. Neither of those goals can be partially achieved and declared sufficient. And so what you get is a structural condition for endless escalation. Not because either side is irrational, but because the logic of their objectives demands it. Let's talk about what this looks like going forward. Because if you follow the internal logic of this conflict, certain patterns become predictable. The first is what we might call expansion through necessity. Right now, the United States is trying to manage this from a distance. Air power, precision strikes, supporting partners on the ground. But there's a problem with that approach. Once you start targeting deeper and deeper into Iranian territory, once you start striking infrastructure and leadership, you create conditions that air power alone cannot resolve. You need to secure assets. You need to hold certain positions. And the moment you establish a physical presence to do that, you have to defend it. And defending it requires expanding your perimeter. And expanding your perimeter creates new vulnerabilities that require additional resources to protect. This is how these wars grow, not through grand decisions made in a single moment, but through a series of individually logical steps that collectively produce an outcome no one initially intended. Then consider how this conflict pulls in other actors. Because none of this is happening in a vacuum, the Gulf states are already under pressure. They are trying to manage their own security, their own relationships with Washington, their own exposure to Iranian retaliation. If any of them formally enter the conflict, the equation changes significantly. And then you have countries like Pakistan. Pakistan has its own strategic relationships in this region. It has its own internal political pressures, and Pakistan has nuclear capability. I want to be careful here because I'm not saying nuclear weapons will be used. I think that is unlikely in the immediate term. But once a nuclear armed state becomes even peripherally involved in a conflict at this level of intensity, the decision-making calculus changes for everyone. Every move is assessed with that capability somewhere in the background, and that alone alters how risks are weighed. There's also the maritime dimension, which tends to get underreported. The global economy relies on a small number of critical choke points, narrow passages through which enormous percentages of the world's energy supply moves. If those choke points are disrupted, not necessarily closed, just disrupted, the effects move through the global economy very quickly. Prices spike. Insurance costs rise. Shipping companies reroute. Supply chains that depend on predictable delivery windows start to seize up. And this is a tool that Iran understands and has the capacity to leverage. If that leverage is applied in coordination with infrastructure strikes, you get a cascading effect that amplifies the economic damage far beyond what either set of strikes will produce on its own. Layered on top of the unfolding military and economic dynamics is the information environment. And its role in this conflict cannot be overstated. Reports are coming in that are incomplete. Events are often unverified, and visibility is fragmented. This fog of war is not merely a descriptive label, it is an active force shaping decisions and outcomes. Uncertainty amplifies fear, and fear distorts decision-making. When governments operate under incomplete information, pressured domestically, and facing the psychological weight of rapidly changing circumstances, they tend to make choices that are more defensive, more aggressive, and more focused on short-term survival than on long-term stability. This is a critical factor in understanding why the conflict escalates faster than conventional logic would predict. Another dimension that deserves careful attention is what happens when leadership is removed mid-conflict. Targeted strikes against key individuals may seem advantageous on the surface. You degrade the opponent's command capacity, create confusion, and gain a tactical edge. But the structural consequences are far more profound. As long as leadership remains intact, there exists the possibility of back-channel communications and negotiated resolutions. Leaders have both the authority and the incentive to seek compromise when it aligns with survival or strategic goals. Remove those leaders, however, and a vacuum emerges, a vacuum inevitably filled by those who thrive in chaos, assert dominance aggressively, and are least willing to compromise. In other words, eliminating decision makers does not just weaken an opponent's operational capacity, it radicalizes their internal political structure, ensuring that future escalation becomes more likely and more uncompromising. The targeting of leadership in this way systematically erodes the off-ramps that might allow a conflict to de-escalate. With these pathways disappearing, the conflict no longer resolves through negotiation or incremental compromise. It continues until exhaustion, collapse, or decisive destruction occurs. Right now, these off-ramps are being deliberately eroded. Leadership channels are being targeted, economic pressures are intensifying, domestic political dynamics are hardening, and ideological stakes are rising. Conventional cost-benefit analyses lose reliability because not all actors are operating purely from a strategic or rational perspective. For many, this conflict carries ideological or historical significance, interpreted through narratives that extend far beyond immediate territorial or political objectives. When participants perceive their actions as part of a larger, historically, or even cosmically significant mission, their tolerance for losses increases dramatically. Suffering along the way becomes secondary to the perceived importance of the struggle, and decision-making at every level, individual fighters, mid-level commanders, political leadership adapts accordingly. What emerges from this convergence of military, economic, psychological, and ideological pressures is a self-reinforcing cycle of escalation. Strikes against infrastructure amplify economic damage. Economic disruption intensifies political pressure. Political pressure drives further military escalation. Military escalation deepens ideological investment. Each dimension feeds the others, creating a conflict that is structurally incapable of containing itself. There is no single lever that, if pulled, would simultaneously slow every dynamic. The conflict grows organically, pulling in additional actors, disrupting systems, and eroding the very conditions that would allow for a negotiated resolution. It is essential to understand that when analysts say this war is getting out of hand, they are not merely referring to the intensity of individual strikes or exchanges. The real concern lies in the architecture of the conflict itself. the ways in which its constraints are disappearing, the ways in which its internal logic overrides the preferences of those who might seek de-escalation. At this stage, the momentum of the conflict largely dictates outcomes. The question is no longer whether the conflict can be stopped, but how far it will spread before it stops itself. Based on the indicators currently visible, the targeting decisions, the strategic postures, the domestic political pressures, and the ideological commitments, there is little reason to believe that the stopping point is near, and there is every reason to expect that the consequences will extend far beyond the region itself. To truly understand what is happening, it is crucial to pay attention to patterns, trajectories, and the underlying logic of decisions rather than merely the headlines of individual events. Individual strikes will be reported and analyzed, but the real story lies in the structural evolution of the conflict, the way it is systematically consuming its own off-ramps, the way it is accelerating escalation across multiple dimensions, and the way it is shaping the strategic environment for all actors involved. Right now, every signal in that architecture points in the same direction, toward a conflict that is intensifying, expanding, and increasingly resistant to conventional forms of control or resolution.